Dr. Andrew Koricich is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges and an Associate Professor of Higher Education at Appalachian State. Influenced by his own experiences growing up in a rural community, Dr. Koricich's research focuses on rural issues in post-secondary education, with a particular focus on rural and rural-serving institutions. And Dr. Koricich, it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Shantae. Good to be here with everyone to share my work. I'm going to get my screen shared here for you all right now. So today, I'm going to be talking with everyone about a project that my research team is in the process of getting ready for release this fall. It's creating a metric to identify rural serving post-secondary institutions. And so just really quick, as far as introduction goes, I want to just give a quick note about ARC, our organization. The Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges is a research collaborative that is aimed at increasing research on and appreciation for regional colleges like Appalachian State and the communities that they serve. We've been housed officially at Appalachian since this summer, and our research team really does come from multiple institutions. You can see our leadership team here. I serve in the role of executive director. My colleagues, Elisa Fryer at the University of Oklahoma is our director of data. Kevin McClure at UNC Wilmington is our director of communications. Cecilia Orphan at the University of Denver is our director of partnerships. And Vanessa Sansone at UT San Antonio is our director of policy. So when we think about going into the work that I'm going to share here, there was really important conceptual pieces that we as a team had to think through before we even started thinking about data and analysis. The first thing was, what does it mean to be a rural serving institution? What are the things that RSIs do? And we have to identify those so that we can then think more about what data allow us to capture those things. And we've come around to these handful here. They facilitate post-secondary educational access to rural communities. They also offer academic programs and other programming that are meant to meet the unique needs of rural communities. So what about them is specifically serving rural communities? And they also serve as anchor institutions in their regions. These are places that are deeply connected to the community, and the community is then deeply connected to them in turn. And so really trying to say these are the three big things that we think RSIs do, whether they intend to or not. And so when we think about the current state of research on rural serving institutions, there's not a lot, and most of it's probably written by myself and my colleagues. But what we have found over time is that RSIs employ large numbers of people from the regions that they're in, and they also hold large purchasing power, especially with local businesses. They often possess a regional service mission, so they're not focused on being national leaders. They're looking in a smaller area to really have an impact. They generate jobs and business opportunities, as well as human, social, and cultural capital for their regions. A lot of these institutions may host the only museum in their county. A lot of them are also places where the community comes together for arts programming, for business incubation, all kinds of things that come up. They also play an important role in shaping the self-identity of the residents living in or near their campuses. Whether regional residents are graduates or employees of the institution, that institution's footprint is meaningful. And a lot of people still start to have some affiliation or affinity towards the institution, even if it's not their own experience attending or working there. And they're also, unfortunately, consistently among the lowest funded institutions in the country. This is both in absolute dollars and in per student allocations. This comes in regards to state appropriations, donations, grants, and the like. So then we had to take a step forward from all of this and really say, why is it so important? If we know a little bit about these institutions, why is it so important for us to put all this effort into coming up with an actual measure to identify these institutions? First and foremost, it's to facilitate more research on rural serving institutions. If there's no real metric or definition, they can be hard to study. How do you find institutions when you don't have a definition for the type of institution you're looking for? It also makes it hard to find students to invite to research studies and things like that if we don't know the institutions to best target. It's also important because having a common understanding, a common definition for a rural serving institution can improve policy advocacy as well, including advocating for better funding for the special mission of rural serving institutions, and especially the special circumstances of their financial disadvantage in a lot of ways. It's also important because rural looks different in a lot of places. Rural Southwest does not look the same way as rural Appalachia or the same as the Great Plains. And so one of the things that's hard under existing data structures is for rural serving institutions to do a really good job of finding true peer institutions that they can use for benchmarking, that they can use for collaboration. And so one of the goals with this is to give them a better way of finding their peers. And lastly, so that we can better measure the contributions of rural serving institutions to their students and communities. This is going to be really key in advocating for more favorable policy, for better funding, is by showing the truly good work that these institutions do with the resources that they do have. So we're going to transition next to talk a little bit about the technical nuts and bolts of what we've done, as well as start to talk about some of the data tools that our team is going to be producing as part of this project. We really wanted to move from sort of a definition of a rural serving institution to more of a measure, a metric, because definitions tend to be more exclusive in that you must have this, you must have that, you cannot be this. And any one of those things could exclude an institution from being classified in a certain way. And that's not what we wanted. We didn't believe that there's any one thing that makes an institution rural serving or not. And so that's why we really moved from a strict definition into more of a measurement approach. We wanted to look at rural serving institutions instead of just rural located institutions. In part because there are institutions that do a lot of service to rural communities, especially public land grant universities, that have gotten so large over time that the communities they're in no longer classify as rural, even though they do a lot of work through their land grant mission to serve rural communities. And so we wanted to make sure we're picking up institutions doing this work who may not be officially in a rural place. We wanted to make sure that when we talk about serving rural communities, that we actually have something rural specific in that servingness piece. It shouldn't just be things that happen to help rural places, but that are specifically supporting rural places. And as I said before, moving away from a checklist and some kind of yes/no indicator into an index score that allows us to look at institutions relative to one another and gives us some ability to be flexible in some of the gray area. The limitations that we've had is that we can't just do a strict enrollment approach. X% of your students are from a rural area because there are no public federal data sets that exist to allow us to do that. There's also no one perfect or even widely agreed upon definition of rural. The federal government alone uses dozens of definitions and states have their own definitions. And so we had to sort of make sense of that too. What do we choose when none of the definitions are perfect? And lastly, the data we have available to us allow us to identify rural servingness, but they don't allow us to say that you're doing a great job at it, just that you're doing it. And so we weren't really able to get into qualitatively, are you doing a great job of rural serving, just whether under our approach, you're doing it or not. And so our we started out with this idea of measuring place. How do we decide what areas, how do we carve out rural or not? The two data sources that we've used for this are the United States Department of Agriculture and the Census Bureau. The USDA's Economic Research Service puts out a data set called the Rural Urban Continuum Code, RUC scores. These are county level data. It's ordinal from 1 to 9, with 1 being the most urban, 9 being the most rural. And these scores are given to a county based on 6 size categories. So just sheer population size, how big the area is, and also whether you're adjacent to a city or not. And one of the things we did with ours is finding that really conflated a couple of things. And so we actually broke the RUC codes apart into the 6 category size variable, and then a separate variable for whether or not the county is adjacent to a metropolitan area. Under the Census Bureau, we looked at rural population within counties. So we can see what is the percent of the population in the county that is rural, and also looking at clusters of counties adjacent to see what is the average percent that's rural in the surrounding counties as well, because they aren't just serving the counties they exist in, these institutions. When it came to thinking about some of the mission piece of this, the rural specific aspects, what we really looked at was the credentials that are produced in fields of unique rural importance. What are the degrees and certificate fields that rural communities just use more of? And we did this both through existing research and analysis of data that were available to us. And so what we really came up with was the percent of any institution's total credentials, whether that's degrees or certificates, that are conferred in the fields of agriculture, natural resources, and parks and recreation. And that came from the Integrated Postsecondary Education Data System, also known as IPEDS. And to put this all together, as I said before, we really wanted to go with an index score instead of just an indicator yes or no, because it's more inclusive, it's more flexible. It allows users of the data to go work on the margins better by not having a hard cut. And institutions are relative to each other rather than saying in a vacuum, you are doing this or not. And so the factor score is done so that the mean is 0, standard deviation is 1. In this data set, we have a median score of -0.23, so just slightly more, less rural serving than rural serving. The lowest scoring one is unsurprising. In Manhattan, the CUNY College of Technology. It's not conferring any of those degrees. It's not in a rural area. It's right in the largest city in the country. The maximum is also not surprising. The Nebraska College of Technical Agriculture, which is probably the most rural serving college name to ever exist. And what we're going to do before we do the public release is we're going to get rid of this negative score piece. And we're going to just go from 0 up to like 4.16 or whatever it'll be. So just as a quick example on how all of these things come together, looking at App State and UNCW side by side, we see county rurality. App State is more rural. App State is not adjacent to a metro area the way UNCW is. More rural in county, higher average rural in surrounding counties, and 50% more credential awards in these 3 fields at App State than at UNCW. And so we can see what their RSI score is coming out of looking at those data points. So I'm going to switch gears here for a second to just show you how we're visualizing this. When we do release it, the big flagship deliverable from this is our mapping tool. So that users can find institutions, get data about institutions, download data files, and really make this as usable as possible for everyone. And so just as we're looking here, all of these yellow dots are actually clusters of institutions. So if we click here on North Carolina, we zoom in and we start to see, how this breaks up more. We'll zoom in further. And now we can start to see, right, where all of these institutions are: 2-year community colleges, private 4-year universities. We can go into here to Boone, and we see Appalachian State, Lees-McRae, and these recluster as you move back out. When you come out here, you can also change the score. So if you only want to see the ones with a really high rural serving score, you can do that. Whoops, went way too out to space. And so what we see is actually the most rural ones, it's sort of this, they're a little bit geographic, right? We're not seeing them over on the West Coast so much. And so you can adjust the scores. You can turn off different things. You can look at only certain states, certain types of institutions. You can look at the percentage of students receiving Pell Grants if you wanted to see places that are serving highest need students. Institutional designations, if you want to look at historically Black colleges, land grants, looking at high Hispanic enrolling and the like. You can also look at persistent poverty counties, things like is the institution in a county with persistent child poverty, population loss, and the like. And so when you pick an institution and you click on it, you get a whole bunch of data here over on the side to tell you about the institution, score components, all of those kind of things. And in the final version, this will be downloadable as a zip file with the graphs and the whole thing. You also see these lit up. And so, so what I'm going to do, I really screwed that up. So I'm going to replace the current one we have. These are the counties that are the adjacent counties. So you can also see the county clusters that we're looking at, and you can compare two institutions to each other. And so then this window becomes a side-by-side. Really just as a way to package the data so that it's as usable as possible for a wide range of users, for researchers, for policymakers, for private foundations that are looking how to donate direct philanthropy. And so we're really excited about that tool and what that can actually mean for people in making sense of this. And then we are also going to be releasing complete data files. We make all of our data publicly available. We're going to have comprehensive data documentation on how we did this, a few research briefs using the RSI list, instructional videos about the maps. We're going to have webinars, podcasts, all kinds of things. And we're also going to have some Spanish language products as well, given the role of Spanish speakers in a lot of rural communities. And so I think I'm going to stop there because I'm pretty close to my 20 minutes and I'm at the brink of going way over if I don't stop myself. So I'm going to pause here and we'll see what questions folks have from the audience.
Well, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. As I said before, I'd like to open this up to questions now. If you would like to ask a question, please type your question into the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen and hit send. We do currently have one question for you. How could a university be affected if the area it is in is recategorized as more urban than rural?
That's a really great question, especially in light of what we're seeing out of these early census releases of new data, and that is really showing a huge population shifts in rural communities and a lot of places decreased population in these areas. The short answer is if the area that the institution is in depopulates enough, urbanizes enough, that could affect whether our measure would call it a rural serving institution. Now, the thing I will say is we did this with data that came out before the 2020 census data came out. And so right now we're going to go with what we have rather than like update it with the new census data at the moment. But it's important to remember that for this to really change, totally throw an institution way off, it's their own county's population would have to change. The population of the surrounding counties would have to change. And they'd also probably have to change the degree to which they're offering awards in those three fields of agriculture, natural resources, and parks and rec. And that's part of this was why we did 4 different measures of place here. The county population, the average surrounding, adjacency to an urban area, and just the absolute population number is so that no one of those could just throw an institution off. It sort of buffers too much change all at once. But really the short answer to the question is if a region's population increased enough from one census measure, one decennial census to the next, and we reran this, it could very much move institutions out if it was a big enough change.
I'll follow up with that. Andrew, that was a great talk. Thank you so much. It's brilliant work. How often are you planning to, I guess, update the data? And you alluded to the fact that this is a stable score based on the fact that it's based on 4 different measures, but I would assume that you're still planning to kind of update the data that goes into it.
Yeah, we haven't settled on an exact schedule yet, in part because once we get into the right schedule, in theory, it's probably only about every 10 years because institutions can change the ratio of awarded credentials in those fields. But if that's only one of 5 metrics in that score, that alone isn't going to totally change where an institution lands in our study. And so what we're sort of looking at is probably within a couple of years, we'll take the new census data and after the dust kind of settles with that, and also let some of these other trickle down things from the USDA, because that relies on census data, but they process it after the census data. And so we're sort of probably looking at a few years before all of the data sets we've used are updated with the 2020 census. But then once we sort of get that together, it's probably going to be looking at, probably about every 10 years, unless we start getting changes in how much some of the data come through. And if I'm being perfectly honest, we're secretly hoping that we can convince some federal agency to just take this over and update it and keep it in their own data systems themselves. But that might be a little too ambitious. What other questions folks have? Go ahead, sorry.
Is your map live?
So the map that I showed is it is a live map. It's in our test site right now. And so the only reason I'm hesitant to share it out is we've got some placeholder data that is way not the real data in some of those. Not for the score. The score is right, but like things like endowment size and things, we're just doing our last data validation now before we load that.
That was going to be my question as well, as far as the map, if it was live, because I was wondering if your research team would, whenever it is live, eventually contact certain organizations that may be looking to help fund these schools and just say, hey, here's our map, here's the research we've done. Would you be willing to help XYZ?
Yeah, and one of the things we want to do with the release as part of the webinars we're scheduling, we do want to have a webinar that's just for funders and to talk to them about how they can fund research about these institutions, fund researchers at these institutions, or just direct philanthropic gifts to these institutions. And again, sort of all the way to back to the rationale of it. If they can't find these institutions easily, they're sure not going to be successful in directing resources towards them.
Yeah, and I sort of have a follow-up on that in terms of what the work of the ARRC, what you anticipate some of the big impacts of it are going to be on these regional serving institutions. So you just mentioned visibility with federal funding agencies. What are some of the other benefits of having these this vocabulary and these classifications and these metrics to talk about rural serving institutions? What are some of the upsides of having it?
I think one of the things that we think is really important that we've heard talking to institutional leaders is just finding institutions like ours. That whenever you say community colleges, they're incredibly diverse, different institutions that you're going to struggle to find a peer. Even if you say rural community colleges, they're not all the same. And so I think just with institutions being able to find who they should be comparing with, who they should be talking to that's like them is really helpful. One of the other things that we hope also happens is that the narratives that come up around these institutions, especially from journalists and things, they tend to be deficit-based when talking about these colleges. And we're sort of hoping that through this, it helps tell more asset-based stories and tells what's good and right about these institutions and places, instead of always focusing on shortcomings. And I think sometimes that's hard for institutions to do on their own. Like it's hard for them to totally change the narrative one reporter at a time. But if we can give institutions better tools to talk about what they're doing, we're not doing it just one reporter at a time anymore. And so I think just when the public narrative about these institutions change, that's going to be a good thing for them as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well, that is all the time that we have today for questions. I'd like to thank our presenter, Dr. Koricich, for offering this session for the Research and Creative Activity at Appalachian Event 2021. And thank you all for your attendance today. Don't forget to visit the event website that's linked in your chat to view other available sessions, research posters, and recordings if you can't attend live.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.